there are still disparities in ASD identification. So I'm just going to put a pin in everyone's celebration. So the most well-known disparity is the sex disparity. So research has consistently shown that females are on average, four times less likely to be identified with autism than males. So there are several different theories about why this is the case. A lot of it boils down to we currently have a male-centric diagnostic criteria, and we'll talk about that a little bit more. And then research also shows that for autistic females, they engage in higher rates of masking or camouflaging behaviors. And so they're able to kind of blend in, look more socially adept than autistic males. And so that may partly be why they're getting missed. So another disparity that exists that people may not know about is research consistently shows that Black kids who are identified with autism are more likely to be identified with autism and co-occurring intellectual disability. So this data is from the 2020 surveillance year of the ATOM network, and as you can see, 50% of Black kids who had cognitive data in their records and were autistic had intellectual disability. And this is something that is consistently shown in research, and we don't understand this.
Is it unmuted? Okay. Making sure that Black females get the appropriate diagnosis and services that they need. So, what do we know about autism in Black women? Spoiler alert, nothing. Absolutely nothing. So, there was a scoping review done that looked at research from 1943 until 2020 that focused on the experiences of Black autistic girls and women. And so from that search, they extracted a whopping 14 publications. 77 years, 14 publications. Of those 14, 6 were monitoring studies. 1 was talking about developmental disabilities broadly. And then 4 studies either only looked at race or sex, so it didn't take an intersectional approach. So we got 3 studies in a 77-year period that feature the experiences of Black autistic females and use an intersectional framework. And it gets even better. So these 3 studies were all case studies, and only one of them was conducted in the United States. So that's why I said we don't know anything about autism in Black women. There are some more recent papers that are being published, but those papers are basically just like calls for action. So they're basically just saying like, hey, there are no Black autistic females in research studies. We need to do something about it. So if any of you in your spare time want to do a lit review, I'm just going to give you a heads up. You're not going to find anything. So for me, when I and other people and colleagues, I have to turn to social media to find out things about autism in Black females. So there are a lot of blogs and Facebook groups and Instagram hashtags and just all the things around Black autistic females. I think there's one more. So we're going to talk about this for Black women and girls who aren't autistic enough, because a lot of Black women and girls have to self-identify as autistic. So, what do we know? And then this again is coming from me diving into social media because there's literally nothing from a peer review perspective. So, like I just mentioned, Black autistic females are more likely to self identify, self diagnose as autistic. And part of this is because of like barriers that affect a lot of people when they're seeking an autism evaluation. But for adults in particular, because there's a really big emphasis on early identification, there aren't really a lot of people, A, who work with adults, autistic adults, and then B, who are competent to do autism assessments for adults. So sometimes it's because they have limited or no access to a specialist. Sometimes it's cost, like with other people. The other thing that is interesting isn't the right word, but it comes up a lot in social media is like that title I showed y'all on the last slide is they are told that they are quirky, but they fail to meet autism, the current diagnostic criteria. So there's a problem with that, and we're going to talk about it in a second. But you see a lot of like, I'm not autistic enough per the current diagnostic criteria. And then another thing that I noticed from social media, but also just friends and colleagues, if a Black woman gets a diagnosis, it's often later in life. And usually it's because they have gone through an autism evaluation for their own child or children. And then it comes out like, oh, my kid is very similar to me. So like, let's see what's going on here. But we know that a late or missed autism identification is associated with a host of negative outcomes. So anxiety, depression, suicidal ideation. So it is really important that we identify Black females as early as possible. So to sum up what we know about Black autistic females, so this is a quote from a really great article called They Don't Know, Don't Show, or Don't Care, Autism's White Privilege Problem. So I trimmed a part of this, but it says, when I, as a Black person, as a woman, as an autistic adult, as the mother of Black autistic children, as an advocate, think about the world of autism research and policies, either they, or should I say you all, do not know, or do not care about Black, Indigenous, people of color very much. So the piece that I cut out is They Don't Know, Don't Show, or Don't Care is from a movie called Boys in the Hood, and a character called Doughboy basically says they don't know, don't show, or don't care about people in the hood. So she framed this quote from a Black autistic perspective. And if you haven't seen this article, I definitely suggest you read it. It is enlightening. So now on to the meat of the topic. So when we're doing autism assessments for Black females, what are some things we should consider? So first, we need to understand our limitations. Most of what we currently know about autism is based on research that was done in the West with predominantly white male samples. So earlier I mentioned this male-centric diagnostic criteria. That's why we say that, because as from the sex disparities, there are a lot more males, especially white males, who are identified with autism. They are who the research samples are tapping into. So we have to think about our diagnostic criteria and our diagnostic tools, knowing that the samples aren't that diverse, they aren't really representative. So there has been research done looking at sex differences in the diagnostic criteria for autism. And so compared to boys, girls are more likely to have better functional social behavior. Be better at reciprocal conversations, especially around topics of interest. Be better at sharing their interests with others, integrating verbal and nonverbal behaviors. They are better at using expressive nonverbals than autistic boys, but not better or equal to non-autistic girls. So that is a strength, but it's still a bit atypical. Um, this make eye contact, I should have put an asterisk there. So some autistic girls are good at modulating their eye contact appropriately for social interactions, but it comes at a cost. So if you ask someone who seems pretty good at making eye contact, they don't like it, it's effortful. And so on the surface level, you might see like, oh, hey, this girl's making eye contact. So we're going to X off that box in the criteria, but it's coming at a cost. And then for relationships, girls typically are better at initiating friendships, but it's the maintenance of those friendships that you see the difference is. That's where the difficulty lies for them. And then for the restricted and repetitive patterns of behaviors, interests, and activities, girls tend to have fewer and more subtle RRBs, and they tend to be more socially appropriate, like reading, arts, animals is a big one. And then they tend to be internalizers and are really big on perfectionism. And again, the interests tend to be typical, but they're really intense. So they are really into art, and the perfectionism comes in. They're erasing, redrawing. Animals, they can give you all the facts about animals. And if any of you have ever done the ADOS and you do Tuesday, I have had a lot of conversations about, is that a frog versus a toad? And something about the cover of the eyes, and I was just like, oh, I did not know that. So, you learn things. So those are sex differences that have been found in the diagnostic criteria. When we think about culture, so research shows that, again, autism is observed across cultures, and then the two broad domains of the diagnostic criteria are found across cultures. But the way that these symptoms manifest, just like girls, is different. So there is often cultural variation in how these symptoms manifest. And so in the DSM, those subdomains, social reciprocity, and the exemplars that are given, sometimes people are rigid in, like, these are all the only things that tap into that, but there's more. Those are just examples. And so how that looks varies across culture. So some qualitative differences, for example, eye contact, we know that there's a lot of cultural variation in what is appropriate eye contact. So in some cultures, it's disrespectful to look an adult in the eye. So we have to keep that in mind when we're doing evaluations. And then there are also quantitative differences. So like stereotype motor movements. Research shows that white boys are more likely to engage in stereotype motor movements, like hand flapping, than children of other races and ethnicities. The other thing that we need to keep in mind is, so for a diagnosis of autism, the differences have to cause some type of functional impairment. So if you have a girl who is good at masking or camouflaging, on the surface, it doesn't look like there's any functional impairment. But because of how much it takes to engage in those behaviors, then you can see an increase in depression, anxiety, suicidality. That is functional impairment. And then also, context matters. So if you have a little black girl who can entertain herself in play, doesn't need an adult involved in her play, that can be really ideal and desirable in a family. If a caregiver is like, hey, I can leave her to her own devices and she's fine, especially if there are other kids who require more attention from parents. Then a parent isn't going to come to your office and say like, hey, she spends a lot of time playing by herself. Like that's, they like that. So just keeping that in mind. And then for our diagnostic tools, I'm just going to focus on the ADOS and the ADIR because those are our two gold standard measures of autism. So research has shown that girls perform differently in the ADOS. So they have better pretend play skills. So in the make-believe activity, birthday party activity, they look better, do better. And then also some girls are better at integrating verbal and nonverbal communication. So for the demonstration task, when you have the kid showing and telling you how they brush their teeth, they may perform better at that task than autistic boys. And then for the ADIR, parents will report that autistic girls are more expressive. And then again, we have the pretend play, like I mentioned earlier, less RRBs. And then because their interests are more typical, less noticeable preoccupations. And there was a recent study looking at differential item functioning across the ADOS-2 modules. And so this study found that 8 items had significant differential test functioning for race. And so 6 of the 8 items were related to social affect, and 6 of the 8 items had greater difficulty and poor discrimination in Black children compared to white children. But the effect sizes were small, so we can't say that these items on the ADOS are driving like under identification of Black kids, but it is important to note that these items aren't always functioning the same across race and culture. So, knowing all of this, what can we do? So it is really important that we take the time to reflect on our own cultural lens and then check our biases throughout the assessment process and challenge our assumptions. So I pulled this table from, this article is for school psychologists, but I think these are great questions. So taking the time to think about like, when a little Black kid comes into my office, what are some of those automatic thoughts or assumptions that I hold about either this kid or this family? Am I thinking about the problem from all potential angles? Am I making sure that I'm thinking about the ways culture is impacting what I'm seeing? Things like that. Something that is really important but can kind of get lowered on the list of things to do, making sure we, as much as possible, establish trust and report. The evaluation process is strange, like it's not a pleasant process. I don't think anyone is ever like, yay, I'm going to get an evaluation. And then for Black females in particular, so again, this intersectionality, they're Black, so there is a history of just like mistrust, distrust, just medical things in the Black community that have not been great. And then they're female, and we know that females can be less likely to be heard than men. I have to think about a good way to say that. And so making sure that our families are heard, knowing that they're coming in with these things historically and then also personal experiences. And for autism, it's really important that we get a thorough developmental history and information about their current functioning. The way that we ask questions is really important, so we need to be flexible in our approach. So like the ADIR has structured ways that you ask questions, but being flexible to rephrase things so that you are getting as much qualitative information as possible to support a diagnosis of autism, because different questions mean different things for parents, and trying to frame things in a way that's understandable and can elicit like some examples. So, oh, when you say it like that, or now that you say it like that, my child does X. Also, do not rely on a high score on the ADOS or the ADIR. I don't even score my ADOSs like total score anymore. The ADOS is just one piece of information that we're using in the autism evaluation. And so if you give an ADOS and then you score it and you're like, oh, they don't meet the cutoff, so there goes their autism diagnosis, you're potentially doing a disservice, because there may be quite a bit of qualitative information in that observation that just isn't getting captured fully by the numbers that we're using. So, just some questions to think about when we're doing an autism evaluation for a Black female. So, think about the quality and intensity of behaviors. So, facial expressions is a big one because I see a lot of girls, and some of them can be flat, like you might expect for autism, but some of them are really expressive, but it's the quality of those facial expressions. So they tend to be very exaggerated, almost theatrical. And so if you don't see them emoting in the session, but you ask a caregiver about it, and they're like, oh, yeah, they show a range of facial expressions, I always follow up with, so what do those facial expressions look like? Can they sometimes be exaggerated? And a lot of times it's, yeah, they are. They are exaggerated. And then for routines, like let's say we have a little Black girl who has a bedtime routine, and for the family it's great because she can put herself to bed. So, like, yeah, you're asking about routines, difficulties, adapting, and it's like, oh no, she has a bedtime routine, but it's fine. I always will ask, has there ever been a time where she couldn't do the routine or it's been disrupted? And usually what will happen is the family is accommodating, so they're making sure that they can get through the routine, because they know if they don't, then it's going to be some problematic behavior at home. Or they're like, no, there hasn't been a time, but you can ask them, so what about other things you've noticed they seem to need to do a certain way, or other people to do a certain way, to try to tap into some of those differences in intensity. And then for Black females, asking about how much effort it takes for them to socialize. So we know females tend to mask more, camouflage more. So just asking if it's developmentally appropriate, asking like, how do you feel after you socialize? Because if that girl or that woman says, I need to be alone for the next day, then that's functional impairment, and that's giving you information about, yes, they are doing some of these socially appropriate behaviors, but it is taking a toll. Like, it is a performance, basically, for them to get through these situations in a way that makes them look like they are neurotypical. Eye contact, I think I mentioned this earlier, is the one that I'll ask about. For eye contact, you also can get where it's not modulated appropriately, so they stare. So you can also like comment and ask about that too, because if you haven't had someone stare at you, it is quite the experience. It makes you really uncomfortable. So ask me about that. You usually get like, well, I was told I need to make eye contact. And so it's like, okay, noted. We got to work on that though. And then for the functional impairment piece, trying to get a sense of, in the home setting, if these things aren't causing any functional impairment, what's happening at school. So sometimes kids will hold it together at school, and then when they get home, that's their safe space. So then they go to their room, they're in their rooms until it's dinner time. Like, they don't have the capacity to do anything else because they have spent the majority of their day trying to blend in with everyone else, and it's taking a toll on them. Also, like I mentioned earlier, for those routines and other behaviors that caregivers aren't necessarily reporting, asking about their functioning in different situations to see if you can get some more examples about if they're engaging in some of these behaviors, and if they're prevented from doing certain behaviors, what does that look like? So, key takeaways. The core features of autism are culturally defined, and they vary across cultures. So we know that disparities in autism identification exist for Black females, and that leads to disparities in outcomes, and that, my friends, is a social injustice. And so we, as psychologists and clinicians, have opportunities to improve identification and outcomes for Black autistic females. And so I hope I went through this fast because I want y'all to stay on time today. But I hope that this was helpful in thinking about ways that we can tailor our assessments to make sure that we aren't missing some of the Black autistic females that come through our clinics. And then I have some resources. So this first resource is a chart that has the autism diagnostic criteria, and it has like basically the stereotypical thinking behind a criteria. Like, eye contact typically is thought of as a lack of eye contact, but then more nuanced or more subtle ways of thinking about it. So like, it's poorly modulated, or they're staring, or it's effortful for the person. And then the next two, the Color of Autism and Autism in Black, are two organizations that really focus on assisting caregivers and Black autistic youth, building community, because that can be really hard. And then just other resources for families and Black youth. And then I got resources, and then any questions folks have. Oh, thank you.
Just that, have you noticed when you're doing assessment that some of the publication for girls, maybe showing more than boys, is like a frozen, almost like a fight or flight of the freeze, where some of it is like that sympathetic nervous system response, where they lock down not knowing what to do.
Yep.
And that gets missed because that's not in the criteria
Yep.
either. And I don't know if that would be considered just like a female response of like, I'm pausing and I'm stuck there. Are you seeing?
Yeah,
that feels like one of the things I see.
Yeah, I see that a lot. And so usually they get diagnosed with an anxiety disorder. And when you look more or you ask more questions, it's more than like a fear of embarrassment or judgment. It's, I literally don't know what to do in these situations. And I've had lots of girls tell me like, oh God, if someone I don't know approaches me, like, that's the worst thing ever. I'm just going to walk away. I'm going to stand there because I don't know what to do. Like, I have these scripts for introducing myself or having a conversation, but the deviation from that is too much. And so you're right, they're freezing and avoiding. And in the school setting, if they're quiet, not really interacting with their peers, the teachers typically aren't going to complain about that because they're getting their work done. So it takes more like non-ASD symptoms to bring them to the threshold of their caregivers seeking an answer, because they're either really, really anxious or they're depressed, because going through their day is really hard because, like school, there are the social demands and they can't deal with it. But usually they get an anxiety diagnosis, and then we do some more digging, and it's like, yeah, there's anxiety there, but there's also autism there too. That's a good question.
I know you said there's basically zero in research on this, and so, based on your experience and knowledge and kind of what you feel like in your expertise, what are the long-term consequences for this, like this non-identification?
It's the mental health of Black women is like, there's a lot that goes into there. So not having the label, even for themselves to better understand, like, hey, this is a part of who I am. Then you have all these like anxiety diagnoses or depression or suicidality, and they aren't sure like what's driving it. And so you see an increase in these other mental health concerns and higher suicide attempts. Just a lot of negative things associated with that, which is really sad and problematic.
And just to come in, I don't see children anymore, but in terms of autism in adult, like females, I'm wondering how many could be misdiagnosed by a psychiatrist.
Yes.
That's what I'm thinking.
Yes.
And I may have overlooked something in assessing like females, because like females have to carry on,
Yes.
take on so much,
Yeah.
have to adapt to so much in their environment. It's just really causing me to reflect on in the past, if I had missed something as a psychiatrist, or it may have been autism.
Yeah, there's, I don't know if any of you are familiar with her. Her name is Joy Johnson. She is a BCBA. She's a Black woman. She's also autistic. She had a running list of diagnoses, including schizophrenia, I think. And then after like incarcerations and just all of these things, eventually got a diagnosis of autism. So it definitely happens.
Now, is that a citation that you can share?
It's not in this one, but I can send. Let me see what her. I think it might be.
And are we getting these slides? Okay. I haven't had a chance, I've been babysitting.
How dare you? Are there any online questions that we know about?
So her website is joyfjohnson.com, and I can email it to. Let's see.
Question, does it make any difference whether the evaluator is a male or female in those diagnoses, Black men? Everyone looks at that.
Depending on the person, probably. Like we get some patients who are more comfortable with females versus males. So I think there isn't a hard and fast rule, but it will depend on the person you're assessing.
Comment. It's really encouraging to see people progressing in terms of being able to more actively identify disorders. Because in the 60s, some time ago, my research with children with attention deficits, we call them MBDs, minimal brain damage. We've progressed because of more ongoing research like this, curiosity.
Thank you. This is her website. Let me see. But her story, yes, Joy Johnson, her story is very interesting. She had a running list of diagnoses.
Was the referral like length of time differ between like a child getting tested versus an adult who realizes they might have autism and wants testing?
Yes, it definitely can, because for adults, you still need that developmental history. And so sometimes the caregiver relationship with the adult isn't great. And so there's like concerns about having the caregiver come in. Sometimes the caregiver isn't a reliable source of information, so you need to try to think of who can provide some of that earlier information. And then what I noticed, because I like to see older kids, like adolescents and adults, is because they have gone undiagnosed for so long, they get these running lists of diagnoses, or because they don't have a question, they don't have an answer to their question, they have all these internalizing symptoms and other issues, and so you're spending a lot of time thinking not only about, is this autism, but is this autism and depression, autism and anxiety, autism and ADHD, whatever. And yes.
Right, so that's kind of one of the things I was thinking about as part of the negative outcomes that you were sharing. And I'm wondering if possibly one of those negative outcomes is that research that you were saying in the beginning about the intellectual disability. If they're not being identified early on, then they're not receiving those resources to help. And is that just a negative outcome because they're not getting the resources? And it just was something I thought of. I didn't know if that was something that had been kind of bantered about regarding it. Because you said that was a pretty large research that continues to happen.
Yeah. So I haven't seen a study looking at the effects of delayed diagnosis for Black females in particular, but there are some studies looking at delayed misdiagnosis, and it consistently shows like these either misdiagnoses or these diagnoses with other things. So it is detrimental to one's mental health.
And I'm just thinking that also whatever medication management they're receiving that isn't being beneficial because it's not addressing what really the concern is.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Welcome.